Hello, and welcome to Jason's Education Lounge podcast, brought to you by Think Academy. At Think Academy, we make learning across K-12 a fun, creative, and engaging experience. Every episode is a conversation with experts in education and education technology, where we talk about learning beyond test scores and provide both educators and parents with solutions that work for their children. I'm your host, Jason. Good morning, and welcome all to today's Jason's Education Lounge, episode 1. My name is Jason, and this is the place where you'll receive first-hand news on what's going on in the sphere of academia, where we'll talk about some of the hottest topics in education and talk to some of the world's most brilliant minds. Unfortunately, for our listeners today, we have on Jason's Education Lounge the pleasure of introducing you to a remarkable mind of our time, Dr. Dominic Yeo. Dr. Yeo is an AEP lecturer in mathematics with a PhD in statistics at Oxford and Masters in Mathematics in Cambridge. Dr. Yeo is also the chair of the British Mathematical Olympiad and academic director of the International Maths Olympiad UK. So thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Yeo. It's really our pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Jason. It's very good to be here.
My first question, to start us off really, to know a little bit about yourself, is what inspired you to pursue a career in maths? What's your influence? Is your friend? Is your family? And once you've answered that, I'm dying to know what is AEP. I've tried to do some research on AEP and I couldn't understand it. So in layman's terms, if you can explain that would be fantastic.
Absolutely. So I'll start with me. So I grew up in London. I enjoyed lots of subjects at school. I enjoyed some things I wasn't good at. I enjoyed sport, even though I wasn't very good at sport and I'm not very good at it now. But academically, I was kind of an all-rounder. And of all the subjects, there just came a moment where I found maths was leading me to places that seemed more interesting than where some of the other subjects were taking me. I've always been relatively competitive, and I had the chance to do maths competitions when I was a kid, and I really enjoyed those both for the academic challenge and the social aspect, but also just seeing the further directions of the subject. I do think many pupils at school don't get from the regular curriculum an outstanding sense of what it would be like to study maths beyond school. And I was very lucky to have the chance to see that. I had some fantastic teachers at school. And from that point, it seemed like maths was going to be the thing that was for me. I was doing quite well, so that was another factor. It's no point pretending that knowing that I probably would be able to get into a top university and that there would be future career avenues inside and outside academia was helpful. I mean, one has to be a little bit pragmatic about these sorts of decisions. And yeah, so I went to university, I went to Cambridge, I studied mathematics, and I kept enjoying it. In fact, I enjoyed it even more. I settled on being a probability theorist. I enjoyed quite a lot of areas of maths, but I particularly started to enjoy probability theory, I guess, in my third year. It seemed like a nice compromise between pure theory and the scope for applications. Probability theorists are in quite wide demand. Even though I have a permanent university job, I still get regular cold call recruiter emails from lots of sources asking if I'm interested in a career switch, which is fine, though at the moment I'm not. I'm very happy in my post. So during my PhD, I got involved with the UK's International Olympiad programme. So I'd actually done some of these competitions when I was at school. I went to the IMO, which is the foremost competition of its kind in the world. So I went to the IMO twice in lower sixth form and in upper sixth form as part of the UK team of 6 participants. It's not the case that the IMO itself, the first year was in Vietnam, the second one was in Spain. It's not the case that those 10 days in Vietnam and those 10 days in Spain by themselves changed my perspective. It was actually preparing for it. I probably hadn't had to work very hard, really, for anything mathematically before that period. So I guess I found out what other people had been going through when they were preparing for their GCSEs. And for me, it was that. I don't think that's arrogant to say. I just think that for me, that was the first time I'd really had to work hard to achieve what I wanted to achieve at mathematics. So I did that as a kid, and then I went to university. And when I started my PhD, I was approached to be involved with training the team for the IMO, so training this next generation of pupils. And I really enjoyed that. I think I was quite good at it. I was quite ambitious. I made sure our students were working hard to achieve their potential. The training I received was excellent, but I also tried to acknowledge some of the gaps and help fill them in. And I've had that role pretty much for 10 years now. So going to the competition each year, working with the country's top problem solvers. So based on that, I am also a research mathematician. I do research in probability, but education matters often have more of my focus than research in probability. And so you asked about my job title. So the AEP stands for Academic Education Pathway. And at my university, which is King's College London, this is a pathway for faculty members who want to have more of a focus on excellence in education, not just teaching more lectures, but developing the curriculum, innovating to bring mathematics teaching into the 21st century. There are many aspects of it that haven't changed that much in the past 100 years. And broadly speaking, that's a good thing. But AEP lecturers and our colleagues lead in promoting educational good practice at the university. Was that a reasonable explanation of that pathway?
Yeah, because when I was researching AEP yesterday, I was thinking if in my monologue I should write down what AEP stands for. But then when I looked at what AEP stands for, it stands for asymptotic equipartition property. It was good that I did not.
Which sounds very interesting. I don't know exactly what that is, but that's not what it stands for me.
Yeah, I understand it now. So thank you for that. And actually, before we went into recording, we had a little, email exchange between you and me about the title of this podcast, which is Why is the UK lagging behind in maths? And you mentioned, if I remember correctly, that you actually disagreed with that statement, which makes this podcast very interesting. And in my monologue just before the question, I mentioned some stats and some existing issues that's happening in education, especially in maths at the moment. So what are your thoughts on what I mentioned and why do you think it's causing it?
So I don't necessarily disagree with any of your monologue, and certainly your stats, I presume, are accurate. I think the question is, how does one want to frame this? And when we say lagging behind in mathematics, do we mean lagging behind relative to other disciplines, lagging behind relative to other countries? And in both cases, whether it's realistic what we would be aiming for. So I don't know, maybe I can suggest we start relative to other subjects. So I looked up the most recent PISA scores, and apparently the UK came 12th in mathematics, 13th in reading, and 14th in science, which are sort of close enough to be basically the same. And the previous PISA ratings, maths was a little behind the other subjects. So that did represent a relative improvement in the ranking. And I guess the question is, to what extent should we focus on maths if maths is doing roughly as well and maybe even slightly better than other subjects that are assessed by those tests? I mean, there's a question of whether the tests themselves are legitimate or meaningful in various contexts, but is there anything special about maths?
Yeah, I mean, the studies have shown various from not only just Reddit posts and stuff like that, that actually there's a huge population where they have maths anxiety. 69% actually mentioned that they feel that they're not very confident with maths in later life. And I guess my question is, what do you think is causing it? Is it something in the classroom that's not doing so well? Are the teachers not engaging? Or do you think it's something that the culturally, because actually a very interesting thing from a cultural standpoint, I grew up in the UK. I came to the UK when I was 10 years old. And in China, if you were good at maths, you're like the rock star. If you're at university and you're brilliant at math, you're the rock star. You're the popular kid. But here, if you're in the first team rugby, first 15 rugby, then you're the popular kid. So I think there's a culture shift. Do you think the issue in the classroom causes this, or what do you think are the causes for the math anxiety?
Well, I think that's a huge factor. And in your introduction, you discussed this extraordinary poll about, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but where only 24% said it was cool to like mathematics. And I think an equally valid question, and possibly more relevant, would be to ask their parents, because, I mean, it would be unheard of for a educated middle-class adult to say, oh, I never really got the hang of using correct punctuation or writing full sentences. Whereas saying just openly that, you never really got the hang of mathematics is much more socially acceptable. And as you say, I think this wouldn't be socially acceptable in other cultures, it would be actually a source of deep embarrassment. Or at least there'd be the option to just say nothing. One would choose to say nothing rather than draw attention to it. And I do think in the light of that, the problem for mathematics is that you don't practice it that much just by virtue of going about in your ordinary everyday life. I mean, children may well not like reading and writing in primary school, but they are still people in the world. And as part of being people in the world, they have to speak to their parents. If we count writing on phones, writing on computers, they are writing somewhere. It's just unavoidable. And so people will organically improve a bit, regardless of what the curriculum tells them to do. I think mathematics is harder because it does require setting aside time to be in I'm doing mathematics mood, rather than, I suppose, if you go to the supermarket, whenever you sort of compare nectar prices or 3 for 2s and things, you are doing some basic mathematics, but it's kind of not quite the same, right? And I don't have children myself, but several of my friends have young children. And, I've been in car rides where people have been practicing times tables with their 5-year-old or something on a long motorway journey. But these are really isolated examples. Normally, maths progress happens in the classroom rather than out in the world. If you don't mind, I'd like to add an anecdote about, you mentioned your cultural differences. I think I have a very good example of this, which is, so as I mentioned in my introduction, in 2007, I went to Vietnam for the International Maths Olympiad. And for comparison, this competition was held in the UK in 2019 in Bath, and we're actually hosting it again in a few months' time, again in Bath, after unfortunately it wasn't possible to host it in Ukraine. Anyway, I'd like to draw attention to one piece of disparity between the IMO in Vietnam and the IMO in Britain. So in Vietnam, the president came to the closing ceremony and presented the top 20 gold medal winners with their prizes on stage. We essentially had a motorcade, like a military accompanied motorcade when we went on excursions. And maybe this is the most extraordinary part. The competition had a talent show where various people did some sort of stand-up or played the piano or things like that. And this was broadcast on national television with their equivalent of a sort of a well-known TV presenter came to host this, and it was broadcast on the TV. None of those things happened at the IMO in the UK. I'm sure it will not surprise you. There was sort of a 2-minute section on BBC Southwest. But yes, there are differences. And we actually found some Vietnamese TV that had a noted school and university age maths teacher who had a regular show on TV presenting a program. It was often about inequalities. We got given his book on inequalities as a gift, and he had his own TV show. And I mean, the UK is very different to that. That's not something which even a top-down directive could make happen. You could certainly demand that there's a TV show about inequalities, but you wouldn't be able to demand that people would watch it. And in reality, people wouldn't watch it.
Absolutely, yeah. I do concur. And I came to UK when I was 10. And before that, all my education was in China. And when I came to UK, my English was terrible. It was not up to par. All my other subjects, we did not learn history. We did not learn geography or the sciences just yet in China. But everything else was in the bottom set, except for my maths was in top set. And at the time, my guardian said to me that, Jason, you should be very happy because math is an international language. Wherever you go, it doesn't change. History may change. Geography is going to change. Sciences, depending on where you are, probably alter slightly as well. But math will always be the same. And now that you mentioned the difference in the way that Vietnam and the UK treats the IMO, why do you think there is such a big culture difference in Asian countries that are so focused on maths, and why is it in the Western countries not so much?
Well, that's a good question. I think there are a lot of factors to it. So it does pass down from one generation to another. If parents are skeptical of the value and interest in mathematics, that's going to pass down pretty much immediately. I mean, I think there is a difference in relationship between parents and teachers in this country and in other similar Western countries versus in other cultures. I suspect in Asia it's changed over the past 20 years in the same way that it's changed here over the past 20 years. And I think, it's nothing new to have the idea of pupils, not just weak pupils, asking their maths teachers, what's the point of learning about quadratic equations? That's a trope in Western education. I don't know if that's such a trope in the Chinese system you describe, and you probably would know more about this than me. What would be the response if a 12-year-old asked their teacher or a 14-year-old asked their teacher, what's the point of learning this? When am I ever going to need to factorize quadratic equations?
I think a classic response would be, this is a stepping stone. So when I was talking to my parents about my exams, because I did GCS and everything, when I did common entrance, my parents say, Jason, this is a pivoting point in your life. And then I did GCSEs and they said, Jason, this is a pivoting point in your life. And then when I did my A-levels, they said, Jason, this is a pivoting point. So I think in the mind of a Chinese parent, it is not so much about, well, more so now, but definitely not when I was in school. It's not about interests. It's about necessity. It's about which subjects can get you the best returning jobs. So math is definitely one of them. And I think that's one of the reasons.
Right. I mean, I do think it is less culturally ingrained to think in that fashion of how far in advance to think about your children's employment possibilities. I left school in 2008, so around the same time as the financial crash. So I was at school during a time of growth, and I definitely don't remember people thinking I should drop my interest in drama and take up hard sciences instead on employability grounds. I suspect that may be more common now than it was 20 years ago, though still less common than in China. The UK has a lot of cultural capital, right? And relative to our population size, our TV is exported to a lot of places. Obviously, it helps that English is, by many measures, the global language, and people would prefer to have English TV dubbed for some things than their own. Like, lots of films are made in the UK that, like, our cultural landscape is different to other countries. I mean, it is unusual, right, to have such a large number of newspapers that make jokes on the front page every day about
Yeah.
current affairs. That's quite a British thing. And I think a lot of people who live in Britain, even if they wouldn't read those newspapers, it reflects their values a bit that that sort of thing happens. So yeah, it's hard to maybe separate parents' mindsets to their children's employability with huge other aspects of British culture. I think a good provocative question is it definitely true that we don't have enough maths people to fill the jobs that are required? I mean, one thing is Britain is a very popular place to come for university, and studying maths at a top British university is a popular option for a lot of people. Universities do not struggle to fill their maths courses by and large, both at bachelor's level and at master's. If you look at PhD applications, people want to come and do maths here from all over the world. So I think the original question, is the UK lagging behind at maths? There are certain framings where the answer is obviously not. But obviously there are also framings where the answer is yes, in some sense. And it's interesting to poke at which ones do we actually want. I think there are a lot of people who, rightly or wrongly, don't want the UK to be like Singapore. And it sort of would be odd if it was like Singapore in its maths education, but not in any other regard.
I agree. And I just want to pick up on the point that you mentioned before, which is about people not willing to give up extracurricular like drama or football over maths. There's a concept that I've recently understood is in the UK, if you're good at football, if you're good at athletics or something, your parents will spend money for you to take extracurricular lessons in football, in tennis, in whatever, to make you better, to realize your potential, so to say. But if you were good at maths in school, if you were showing, a lot of potential, they go, oh, great. You're getting straight A's, fantastic. And that's the end of the conversation. There isn't a such situation where, oh, my child is really good at maths. Let me find him some extra help that he can't get in school to help him realize his potential. And I think that's something that, I mean, at the moment, we're talking about the culture as well. In China, it's very much the case where if my child is good at maths, great, let's give him some, harder, more challenging questions. But in the UK, I don't really see that coming across. Would you agree?
I'd somewhat agree. I think there's huge disparity in what children would receive in different contexts. If you're a parent and you know nothing about football, but your kid is really into football, I think you might still have a reasonable guess about what you might do about it. You're going to be sort of attending while they play football, but you're not going to be sitting in their maths lesson. So maybe it's not so obvious. Schools struggle to find trips to take their maths classes on. I think it's pretty obvious what you might do with your French class as a school trip. And as a history class, there are going to be options. The UK has a lot of historical sites. It's not hard to find somewhere to go. But genuinely, teachers discuss with us that it's hard to come up with things, and a lot of the things that do exist are just not very exciting. So I think that's a related point. It's not clear to people what to do. I think some people do just follow the option of do next year's syllabus, push people up a year, and that does sort of solve the problem in the short term. But it's not clear that really achieves what we want it to achieve. So, I mean, my work with the UK Maths Trust partly involves providing avenues for the strongest pupils who like problem solving to apply what they've learned in more non-standard ways. And if they enjoy that, there are further levels to go on to. But I agree that there isn't always a sort of well-established national trend for this. And teachers are busy. So, I mean, it's not fair to say that, teachers should deal with this. They're very beholden to certain outcomes, and these aren't the most important outcomes from the point of potentially some administrators or external observers. Your strongest mathematical minds achieving the full measure of their potential is not something that shows up in league tables.
I agree. And even now, when I talk to the state sector, there's a huge issue with funding with teachers. And there's actually a huge lack of math teachers in the state sector. And I think that's one of the contributing factors to why pupils are not, because they don't get enough support in the classrooms, in the schools. And parents simply, maybe due to circumstances, they can't afford for them to have extra help. And going back to something that you mentioned about helping the most talented children, the debate on nurture and nature has been going on forever. And there's various people arguing on both sides. And I'm a very strong believer of nature. I believe genetics is 70% of what we make it out to be. No statistics. It's just how I feel, by the way. And for example, in sports, the height in basketball, the strength in weightlifting, etc., etc. Do you believe that one is either born with or without the ability to excel at maths? Or can it be trained at an early stage, say 3 to 8 years old in the child's development?
I don't know. I mean, the problem is so hard to do a fair test, isn't it? I mean, social factors just will always dominate. So I have a statistic that I saw recently that relatively few people in the population have PhDs. But if you do a PhD, it means at least one of your parents is 25 times more likely to have a PhD than if you were a randomly chosen person in the population. I don't think that's a great statistic, though, because actually, if you're in a position to do a PhD, there are plenty of other things you could do instead. And while I very much enjoy mathematics, I also think there are lots of students I work with who could do a PhD, and at some level it's a shame that they don't, but also what they're doing instead is probably excellent too. I mean, let me put it this way. How many members of parliament in the UK, what proportion have a science degree? It's not very high. I think it's quite a lot lower in Germany. I don't have the exact stats to hand. But wouldn't it be great if people who were capable of doing a maths PhD in fact went and became ministers in the government? It would be odd to describe that as a failure for mathematics. Going back to the nature and nurture aspect, I think there are plenty of young people whose parents have put a huge amount of effort into trying to make them better at mathematics than they maybe seemed naturally and didn't succeed. But there are probably also quite a few people who, that effort got them over the hump. Then it felt more natural after that. I don't have a hugely strong answer to that. Mathematics suffers slightly from the perception that it's all things are either right or wrong, which is not true later. But I mean, essentially it is true at primary school and for most of secondary school. And so the disparity between being strong and being really struggling ends up being quite high. In an English exam, it would be very odd if the teacher was awarding some people, if all of them actually did the exam and wrote their essay or whatever, and some of them were getting 95 and some were getting 15, that would probably be a sign that there was something structurally wrong. Whereas that happens all the time in mathematics. It's a hierarchical subject. If people get behind, it really is hard to catch up. And so I think there are people who just like winning and being publicly obviously perceived to be good at something. I think that is more of a factor than people give it credit for.
No, I totally agree. And when I was growing up, I played tennis and I took extra math. I actually took, in China, it's called Olympic maths or something like that. You start training from a very young age. And I played tennis once a week and then I went to maths once a week, every 2 hours. And I said to my parents, I got so fed up by the age of, I think, 9. I said to my parents, I would rather play tennis every single day than go to another one of those maths sessions, because it was really sort of in a classroom where you have about 60 pupils. The parents would be sitting at the back listening in, and then the teacher will be at the top. And then a lot of times as a child, you feel very pressured. You put your hand up to answer the questions, or else my parents are going to ask me, oh, Jason, why didn't you put your hand up during the session? Why does, Billy's kid knows this question? So you have that pressure. And so I didn't go to extra maths anymore. After my GCSEs, when I went into A levels, I was one of those people that dropped maths. I studied contrary to my stereotype. I dropped maths. And later on, I joined a company that teaches maths. And when I joined, I did a sort of like a test at the beginning. And I thought, how hard can it be? A British company teaching maths, how hard can that be? And I went and I got 20 and the full marks was 100. And then the manager said, oh, Jason, why don't we move you into marketing? Why don't you do something else? And that's where I am. And I don't think I'm one of those people that had an instinct for maths. But I think my early education with the being forced into learning things has helped me now with my, for example, very fast calculation, with logical thinking, with problem solving. I think those are the 3 skills that really stuck with me, and I can feel them every single day. Though the technical things may not apply, but the underlying process into how to solve a question really stuck with me. And I do agree that nature is a big part of it, but I think the nurture is also a huge thing.
I'd like to make a sort of related comment that, so we talk about nature versus nurture, but there's also the question of necessity, which forms the third part. And the question is, to what extent does it feel important to be good at these things? Obviously, it's tempting to say, adults have this all the time. There are loads of tasks and projects we'd like to do that we never quite get around to. When things are necessary, it can enter a different part of our motivational space. And I think in other cultures, especially the one you've described, my parents think this is important counts as necessity, whereas I think that's just less so in the UK. I'd like to touch on a sort of related comment, which is people who struggled a bit with maths at school, but did better in the humanities. That was sort of a better fit, as you say, like logical argument, writing coherently. These are all things that are useful in mathematics later, but they're less important when you're 14. But I'm sure all of us are aware of friends who have had to acquire skills in their job that seem quite alien to what they studied at university or what they specialized in during A levels. And that doesn't mean it's no work for them to acquire these skills, but they become acquirable. There are people I'm aware of. I have a friend who studied a sort of combination of languages at university. This person hadn't done maths A level and had apparently very much struggled with it at GCSE level, hadn't done very well at all, and nonetheless was able to pass exams to be a tax lawyer. And there was quite a bit of mathematics in it, talking to this person about, but I think they recognise that maybe I wasn't the best person to ask for help on things like exponential growth and percentages. But these are things that people can get better at when it feels like they really need to progress in their job, and seeing them in context unlocks sort of capabilities that maybe hadn't previously been clear. I mean, it's fashionable for people who are opposed to education more generally to say, why aren't we teaching people how to do a tax return in school rather than these mathematical topics? I think it's obvious why we aren't teaching people to do a tax return, because it's actually not that difficult, and it's sort of not directly relevant until you know what you'll be doing a tax return for. We don't have loads of examples to practice on that really make sense. So I think necessity is an important thing to focus on. If somehow society or your family or your job conveys that there is no option but to become good at this, I think that does help.
That wraps up this episode of Jason's Education Lounge podcast. A shout out to our parent company, Think Academy, a company that provides world-class online and in-person education programs for K-12 students. We're proud to be different, result-driven, and focused on the specific learning needs of your child. Check out our website at www.thinkacademy.uk. And a big shout out to Fame for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening, folks. Stick around for more insights in our next episode. Catch you later.